Hey everyone, thanks for coming. We're going to get started. Sorry for starting a little bit late. The trains made it a bit hard to assemble this panel. This is how I was thinking that we were going to run things tonight. First, I and then the other two editors and founders of Commune Editions will sort of talk about our vision for the press and our sense of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then all of us, and then Jasmine can kind of contribute to that conversation as she sees fit, and she can talk about her own sense of where her work fits into what we're doing. And then we'll all read some of our poetry, just briefly, probably 10 minutes a piece. And then, what? At most. And then we'll kind of open it up to discussion, and you can ask questions, and we can make it a little bit more freeform. So I'm going to start talking about Commune Editions and what it is and what it isn't. The project, as some of you may know, kind of emerges from our shared experiences in the Bay Area over the last 5 to 7 years, participating in various kinds of political mobilizations and protests and riots and things of that nature. And we started to become aware that there were lots of poets participating in these kinds of things, and we had a sense that there was a kind of convergence of communities, of political communities and poetic communities, and we wanted to find some way to recognize that fact of alignment. And this is, nothing new in a certain sense. It's a return to conditions that have existed for a long time. And in many places, the idea that, some large percentage of the poets that you might meet were also revolutionaries and dangerous for that reason was just expected. And so maybe this is kind of a return to conditions that you expect to find in other places. So we founded Commune Editions with the idea of kind of rendering visible this kind of politicization of American poetry in this moment, and our sense that a lot of the work that people were doing was kind of registering these political experiences. At the same time, one of the things that has been that I found difficult to articulate, at least, I don't know if they find it difficult to articulate, is that we are against, or I am against, and I think they're against it too, but maybe not in the same way, against a kind of what I would call poetic substitutionism. This sense that poetic practice can substitute for political practice as such, and can be politically effective on its own. And we didn't want to say that the work that we were doing as poets writing poems was, sufficient to that end. It isn't. And we wanted to kind of make it clear that this was something that we were doing alongside the work that we were doing out in the streets, and it's sort of an adjunct to that. We're there as poets, and because we are, political beings, we are expressing our experiences in our poetry. I think we've thought a lot of different things about the relationship between poetry and political action, and that's another thing that I think we've tried to articulate in a number of different ways. Some maybe successful and some not. I personally am fond of thinking of poetry as a sort of promissory note. That's to say that it's not, poetry may not be effective politically in any sense, independent of some context that might make it effective, right? But that poetry kind of mobilizes ways of being in the world and ways of using your senses and ways of being alive to language and to experience that, foretells a kind of moment where everybody would have access to that sort of aesthetic experience. So there's something about poetry that indicates a kind of, a world beyond capitalism when kind of aesthetic experience would be freed from its attachment to writing poems or making art objects, and would be kind of generalized in society at large. So that's how I like to think of what poetry is, as sort of index of a kind of way of being that doesn't really exist right now. And in that sense, Commune Editions is sort of a placeholder for me of kind of something that, that may take place at a later date. So that's probably all I'll say right now. I'll turn it over.
I don't have anything to add to that necessarily.
Yeah.
No. I mean, maybe the only thing that I would add is that the kind of constantly trying to figure out the contradiction between a sort of poetry project that wants to think about its relationship to a certain kind of other sorts of, a certain sort of politics, without making a claim that poetry is the politics, feels to be often make people's heads explode, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of like trying to work it out in some way. And I always have the moment, like when Jasper was saying that we might agree and we might not agree, like there's moments of agreement and not agreement. And I always kind of want to acknowledge that poetry seems really important, or culture seems really important to various anti-colonization movements. And I never want to underestimate that. At the same time that I don't want to make a lot of claims about my poetry as like a revolutionary practice or leading to the revolution, or if we just write poems that will lead to the revolution, because that would be nuts.
Yeah, I think the exact opposite of all of that. No, that's not true. I mean, there's not much left to say after those things. I mean, the one thing I would talk about in the history of the press is just the way I understood it sort of technically or mechanically, which is, I published a couple of books of poetry before, as the other editors had, and the balkanization of the publishing industry, mostly you publish your poems and they get marketed to, and if they get marketed at all, and sold to other poets, which is okay. I mean, people who do should read, and read should do, and so on. But one of the ways I think that we had of not wanting to get hung up in the aesthetic magic of poetry as such, as having special properties, was thinking of it as one of the ways that you could work through your politics, right? And think about your politics and your political commitments and your affiliations and your hopes and your dreams. And so we had an idea that we wanted to make a press that was not a poetry press, but that was a press with a certain sort of constellation of political commitments and relationships that we would be working out through poetry, and probably other people would too. But we didn't think of it as first a poetry press. Poetry was the medium for this set of problems and questions. And we wanted to find a way to share those problems and questions with a community that was not in and of itself a poetry community, even if many people were poets or read poetry or both, but instead had shared political commitments. And that actually turns out to be harder than you think. And one of the magical, and I don't use the word magical lightly, I'm not a fucking hippie. One of the magical things about Occupy Oakland was that for a period when people were feeling good about it, or intense about it, or optimistic about it, there was these real overlaps of communities. And so there would be lots of kinds of events, but among them would be poetry readings, and there'd be quite large audiences, most of whom were not poets, or had not published poetry, or not written poetry, but were interested in what their comrades were doing. And this is one of the things their comrades were doing. And they were very energetic, they were very different in their feeling and experience, and I think it's fair to say that all of us, we loved that, and that felt great. We wanted that to keep happening, and we'd love to say and we have kept that channel open with Commune Editions. When Occupy really waned and became, in certain ways, when it stopped moving outward, it started moving inward and having various kinds of internal struggles and internecine debates that were probably necessary but also destructive. Those kinds of new cohesions waned a little bit. And that's been difficult, but I do think of Commune editions as one of the ways to try and preserve something that was happening on its own without any sort of institutional particularity to it at the time. And this is a way to sort of try and keep it alive and be faithful to it.
Yeah, I don't have anything like really that much different to say than the editors of Commune Editions. I'm coming from like a different kind of like place because I wasn't at Occupy Oakland. I was here, and I actually was in Philly when Occupy was happening, and then also moved to New York when the Trayvon Martin stuff was kicking off. But it's like, yeah, like poetry is kind of like this like living document, like where it's like kind of like a tool to like go back and like reflect. It's like, yeah, it's like kind of interesting where like, you know, you have like political text where it's like the history of like something that happened. And I feel like poetry is like the thing that like slip through the cracks when it happens in these situations. Like, it's more interesting like what's actually like, it's not actually interesting what the truth is when you're reading poetry. It's like, I think it's more so the lie that like is happening within like the schema and like the kind of fantastical nature of like, you know, how you can tell a story and whether it's true or not. Or, yeah.
Thanks. I mean, one thing I would just add is, while we may not have been totally successful at escaping poetry institutions as places where we do what we're doing, I think we try to do that, and we try to kind of take our work towards, you know, kind of other spaces and find poets who are sort of doing things outside of poetry institutions. And we met Jasmine, Juliana, and I at a gathering that was devoted to kind of bringing people together for political discussion and reflections on recent struggles, you know, and it just turned out that a lot of us there were poets, and there was a poetry reading, and Juliana and I heard Jasmine read her poetry, and we were really impressed. So there, you know, there is a way in which, you know, there's things happening with poetry sort of outside of the institutions in which many of us expect to encounter it. And we'd like to be kind of attentive to that. So I guess this is the part of the evening where we read our poems. So,
that part.
I'm gonna start. So I wrote this book. I can't actually show you the title because I don't. This is the kind of printer's proof which I used to read from, but you probably saw it in the front. It's called "We Are Nothing and So Can You." It's written in alternating passages of prose and lineated poetry or verse, and the lineated sections more or less deal with kind of present moment occurrences, and the prose sections have a kind of science fictional, futural quality to them. Just in relation to what we were talking about, the title of the book comes from a kind of patch of graffiti that appeared on the wall after a riot in kind of beachside town of Santa Cruz. And so this is an example of, you know, me taking my poetry from, you know, from things that have happened and from kind of acts of language that were not mine. I'm kind of borrowing this phrase that somebody had written on the wall. And a lot of this book is written as a kind of reflection of things that have happened over the last 5 to 7 years. Some things I participated in, some things I just, you know, read about or heard about. And so it really is a kind of, in a way, I think of it as a kind of collaborative document, a collaboration with all of the people who were out in the streets, you know, over the last 5 to 7 years. So that's all I'll say. So I start with a prose section. Because there were more rules then there were things, many more, countlessly more, because, indeed, the rules made little whirlpools of infinite abandon inside the things, which seemed removed the more they seemed ruled. And because everyone and everything seemed to have its own rule, its own disenchanted genius, so that no one could really be said to be ruled at all, if rule then meant a domination we shared. Because anarchy, in other words, and each of us slated to suffer a unique violence, a violence like a name with nothing general about it. Some thought this meant that communism was already here. Others thought it meant communism was impossible, since we would never be able to match up the electrical flares in our brains with the patterned inertia we encountered. But wasn't that the point? The unworkable? At least we were tired of it, whatever it was, tired of rehearsing under the rotting awnings a few moments of unverified intimacy from the last hours of the little credit we had left. Was that seriously what was meant by art after all the bandages had been removed? We had burned all the banks by the sea. Ours was not a normal darkness, not, in other words, the darkness of shadow, of obscuration, light blocked by solids. No, ours was a radiant darkness. It spread out from our skin like any shining, except that it canceled shine. Dragged into the clearing at the heart of all hell breaking loose, it fled from us and into the stars. Kicking through the liquid crystal displays into the musty rooms of pimply middle-class adolescents intent on bringing down the government for reasons no one could articulate, because all articulation is, in fact, raison d'etat, a red herring at best. The most you can do is trick it out to fit the limits of your particular human organism, its mangled sensorium. We get an old city bus and give it the number of a line that doesn't exist, 47 or 810. Immediately, we exclude all those sad characters who know where they are going and want to go there, who think in terms of means and ends, origin and destination, or who are compelled to do so for reasons of material or perhaps moral circumstance. This narrows our range of writers less than you might imagine. Indeed, we estimate that at any one moment, fully 1/5 of all passengers are there for reasons other than the desire to get somewhere in particular. People who could care less where the bus is going as long as it's going. People whose bodies are exhausted and just want a place to sit down. Kids who are more interested in each other than anything else and who follow with collapsed heads the colored signscape of the world. People who carry their faces in their hands. People who carry things in plastic bags. People who carry other people. Eventually, we have so many buses running, so many constantly improvised lines, and so many partisans running into and out of the buses and grabbing provisions off the shelves of corner shops with or without guns, and taking the gas that we need from the gas stations with or without guns, with or without leaving behind the mutilated corpses of police, and getting off one bus and onto another, that the buses become like the rooms of a disarticulated mansion, whirling through space and crossing and recrossing, combining and disassembling in a stupid, manic dance. Some buses are entirely dedicated to sleeping and some to eating. Some buses are 24-hour dance parties, and on some buses, people bicker constantly. There are theoretical buses and flirtatious buses. There are sanitation buses and fully armed bank robbing buses, and buses that hate all the other buses. There are so many of these buses spinning through the city that eventually it truly is as if they were themselves the only thing stationary in a crazy world jumping about in every direction, as if space had too many dimensions to be space, but not enough to be time. And I'll just read one more. In London, they make it French. In Greece, in different voices, make it rain, location on vacation, like all the Puerto Rican barricades, reroute the roads to Rome. You can blockade them from home by remote control, scramble the traffic signals, make it January in July in Oakland, Billy's in the Nazi room, Claire's in the loading dock. In the US, they still make money. In China, they can make anything take time. By combination of parts made of making do, we can't make out the places on the map they've made dark in daylight, in time for New York to sink behind the paywall, the lake of ink, the make and model scaled up to circle the squares forever, to drown the crowds in open skies.
Sometimes it feels like it's over and it's not. Sometimes it feels like it has just begun and it's over. It's dark often at these times, urban though, so a certain version of light too. It's hard to predict if it will start on time or how late. I'm often a little late and it has started. Last night I could tell from the copters overhead that I was late. As I walked up, the blocks around it were emptying out. Parents pulled their children home. The night herons settled into trees. That's the outer ring. As I got closer, all that was left were the blinking lights of the motorcycles blocking the intersections and the men and few women in uniforms that mill about the corner, helmets in their hands. They talked among themselves, ignored me mainly. One told me how to get around. I did not clarify that I was walking towards. You can hear it sometimes. It often has a soundtrack. Sometimes it has drums and brass. Sometimes just joy. When I am late, I'm trying to guess its path. Last night, several times, I got close to it only to be turned back by a line of cops. They let the media through but turned me back. Then it turned the corner and there it was. At that moment, I melted my body into it and it embraced me. Rosy-fingered dawn and all that. Come here, it sang. Listen. And then I was borne along by the waves all night and the whirlpool, the fig tree, and I was the bat hanging on patiently. A Rav came up and hugged me. Someone grabbed me from behind, and I thought it was Artem, but later realized it was Barat. So much mask. I grabbed Charlotte's hand and held it for a while when things felt dicey. It felt dicey as they cornered us from two sides, and we went down the tight side street up the hill, Charlotte's hand. It's like that, moving from isolation to the depths of friends. At first, we didn't mask up. We were poets. Then slowly, one by one, we did. As I got churned, I mean. Sometimes I still don't mask up. It often feels hubristic. I keep a bandana in my pocket. It isn't super effective. It falls down a lot. Last night, I tied it around my neck as we walked up the side street hill. I pulled it over my face as I walked past the line of cops. I noticed Emma there throwing eggs. I ducked. 2 balloons filled with paint flew by, visors suddenly yellow. She said to me, "How is your heart?" And I at first worried her question. Then I realized she meant my heart and how it was turned. "It is good," I said. "I am opening it. I am expanding it," and I meant it. "I love you," I texted Felix. "Love you," I texted Haruto. Texting Isabella and Jackson, "I love you guys. I miss you." I texted "love you" some 43 times in the last few years. I texted greater than heart some 33 times. Love you 18 times. Miss you 38. She said, "Your feed is all riots, plants, picnics, and poets." It was an accusation. She was noticing that I had got churned, and I said, my son is in my feed too." I didn't bother to argue the riot with her. Still, that moment, churned moment. I was at the poetry reading, and Mia didn't go. She was supposed to read too, but she didn't. She said she wanted to see what happens, and then she texts, "I love you." And I know then that Trader Joe's has been looted, all the wines out in the street. Such sweet elixir, FOMO. Then the rest of that night, we quickly say goodbyes after the reading, refuse the offer of going to drinks, careen from the reading to our home. One of us on Twitter the entire time, texting too. While we are driving, one of us at home runs into the streets towards the gas. I drive up and two of us get out of the car, and I stay in the car and drive the few blocks home. My son has fallen asleep in the back. I am coughing in the car from the gas. He sleeps through it. I take him out and carry him up to bed. More texts, I love you, I text, come by and get me when you are done. Later that night, I go out. Mikhail stays home with Minjun. I go to a fight party, Marxist versus nihilist. No one knows which is which. Muhammad, my fighting teacher, texts, I miss it. I love you, I text. Muhammad, my fighting teacher, fights. I miss it. I love you, I text. She texts back, I'm high on being slugged. My eyes are swollen. I lost, I'm turned. Standing outside, a woman gets kicked out of the club. The bouncer tosses her out and into us. She is fucked up, and this feels awful to her. Her arms widely swinging indicate this awful feeling. It feels awful to us. Another woman tries to help her, and she slugs her. She misses, and the woman who she has tried to slug takes her, calms her down. I hear her saying, I love you, over and over. Later, I will learn that she spent the entire night talking the woman down. It's like that. When turned, sometimes one needs to be held. Still later, I stand on the street outside my house and watch the T-Mobile get looted. A man tries to stop another man who has his hammer at the ready in front of the window. The man who is attempting to stop the hammer gets hit in the face with the butt of the hammer. I decide to go to bed. It is 3 a.m. I text Nathan and say, I love you, and I'll leave the key in the box for you. The march continues on. Nathan continues on, turns left a block away. And then when Nathan texts me back, I know the Whole Foods is looted, and they are all drinking champagne, dancing. All of them will get a cold later. Riot champagne becomes a term among us that winter. I wasn't there, but I was there too. My germs were there. I too had that cold. Is this poem too heroic? I'm sorry. I worry it is, or I know it is. We are turned to mere vandals at moments, I'll admit it. Every computer in that shop, every phone in that one, every car in that car lot. I don't want it to be heroic, but last night I turned the corner and Nora was there with her bike, and when I saw her, I said, I love you. And we walked down the street. As each window was cracked, they got turned. Eventually we dispersed. I jogged for a few minutes away and out of the kettle. We joke, circle back to watch a car burn. Oliver walks by. He is hurrying towards the dispersal. I love you, we say to him as he heads off. The car burns, the fire truck arrives. As I stand there watching it, it is as if everyone I have ever texted I love you to walks by. I love you, we call out to each other. A group of women walk by the car and stop to take photographs. So much joy they have. They are laughing with such triumph, selfies and all, turned. This poem is true. I have texted I love you and its variations over and over. Sometimes I barely knew you. But the names are not true. This is not a coterie poem. Is it a milieu poem? Can it be a movement poem? I took all the names of this poem and never wrote them in. There is no electronic record of them. I found a list of the most popular baby names for various countries in 2015, the year in which I am writing this poem. I made a list, one male and one female from each list, and then I alphabetized it, and I put these names in this poem one by one. I got to O. But Olivia, Sanvi, Santiago, Seyun, Sophia, you, and Zainab, I love you too.
This is a three-part poem called The Fire Sermon. The first part's called A Red Epic, which is also the title of the book. Mediators, matadors, how trivial and objective this world is. Semiologists, stevedores, how objective and trivial, equally fucked we are. Well, not equally. I have an MCM aesthetic and a radio-controlled death drive. There are two parties to every romance, the waged and the wager, and it has been getting harder to decipher the difference. A throw of the dice will never reveal the real subject. Oh, mediators, stevedores, etc. Madrid is sometimes in flames, though confusingly, the Spanish stairs are in Rome, which is often in flames. Oakland is sometimes pleasingly in flames. Athens is almost always aflame. Also Thessaloniki. Big data murmurs to me the likelihood that at a given profit rate in a given sector, a given household debt, a given wage deflation, a given neighborhood would be in flames. Given fire is the unfettered substance of the situation. To begin again from the beginning, to write only for one's friends, 2 lovers make a 0, 2 speculations make a hedge. If tender buttons had been written by capital, instead of objects, food, rooms, it would have a single section called labor power. Though technical language is not conducive to enlisting popular support, if lunch poems were the poetry of the future, it would be all like, I communize this, I communize that. Part 2 is called Transistor. There will be a revolution or there will not. If the latter, these poems were nothing but entertainments. If the former, it will succeed or fail. If the latter, these poems were better than nothing. If the former, it will feature riots, fire, and looting. And these will spread or they will not. If the latter, these poems were curiosities. If the former, it will feature further riots, manifestos, barricades, and slogans, and these will leap into popular songs, or they will not. If the latter, that's that. If the former, these popular songs will be overcome, or they will not. If the latter, these poems were no different than the songs. If the former, the popular itself will then be abolished via riots, barricades, manifestos, occupations, and fire, or it will not. If the latter, we will spend several more decades talking about culture. If the former, the revolution will at this point be destroyed from within or without. If the latter, these poems went down fighting. If the former, it will feature awful confrontations with former friends, and there will be further manifestos, new slogans, ongoing occupations, and communes, and lovers will be enemies. We do not know what will happen after this point, but surely this is enough to draw some preliminary conclusions. The poem must be on the side of riots, looting, barricades, occupations, manifestos, communes, slogans, fire, and enemies. 3, poem ending with a line from Niedecker. I keep my mind under my arm, where I hold my head when I walk down to market. When I walk down to the market, the actions are social, but the mind is private. When I walk down to the inferno, the mind is private. I had a vision, the mind is privately held under my arm. When I walk, I had a dream, had a Baudelaire, had a Rimbaud. The action is social, but Apollinaire walks down. He promenades down to market, promenades in the market, walks out, walks home, walks through streets named after market towns. The names are social, but the century is private. The inferno is social, but the mind follows the head, thinks we can leave, thinks we can go down to the market and leave. Just leave. Thinks we can be in it, but not of it. You know all too well that the best poetry is not the least revolution. You know also that poetry is the best way available to you to affirm this truth. Now we start to see how the trap is sprung, how it was sprung and all before you were born, mind under your arm in the poetry market that exists, despite the spontaneous wailings of the poets, who believe there must be no market because they cannot afford that for which they should not have to pay. The action is social, but the market exists as the secret police exist. Alas, the market will never send you to jail for your poems, though we all believed in private we were worth jailing for the terrible sedition of our dithyrambs, believe we deserve this honor in a no pasaran, todos somos pussy riot sort of way. Yet the good reader geared for riot, zip ties dangling, cometh not for us. The world of the poem is the world. The world is abstract and real. The poem fails just when it is victorious, because one cannot live the absolute of victory over the sun until one can, and we do. And many will die when this happens. Poetry will be renewed in the blood of the negative and dreadfully much else. I often say to myself, why would you ever leave the West Coast? But it's really nice to be here, in part because I'm seeing some old friends, but in part I'm seeing a huge number of people I just don't know, which happens more when you go away from home, and I really appreciate that. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read 2 short poems and pass it on to Jasmine. This is called Metallipsis for Wien Hua, who's a friend of mine and a poet. As I have argued elsewhere, I was just at a conference, an academic conference in Boston, where like half of it is like, as I've argued elsewhere. People say things like this over and over, and then they sort of say, well, I think you can see where that's going. And they basically never say anything. They just have these, I had a dream I could make a poem just out of those kind of devices, which metallipsis, but this is what happened. As I have argued elsewhere, most people are Rihanna, and the rest are Donald Sutherland. Or maybe Michael Caine, whichever one was in Alfie. I don't mean this typologically, like there are 2 kinds of people. There are 2 people in the world, and they share certain things, but have never met, and we are them. All of us are them, and this is okay. In fact, I would give my left eye to be the beautiful boy who is in Alfie, but I'm not. I'm Rihanna. This is my flag of convenience when I am walking with headphones on through the theory district. This poem is called Hikexiety. I didn't wake up one morning and say, I really need to give a poem a Latin title. The word doesn't quite exist in English. It's usually translated as thisness. Or thatness. If what you want is calm to be restored, you are still the enemy. You have not thought through clearly what that means. If what you want is a national moment of silence, the indictment of a single police officer, or 2 or 3, you are still the enemy. You have chosen the reverie of law for you and your friends. If you want another review panel, a Justice Department study, a return to democracy, rather than for riot and looting to leap beyond itself from county to county, rift to rift until it becomes general, you have not understood what a revolution is. It's just this. It's coming out again, night after night, more of us than there are of them. It's saying no to every deal. Remember, nothing belongs to you because nothing belongs to anyone. Thanks.
Es lo que hay. Naked branches hunger through the night, stretching up towards God, asking for forgiveness for their appearance, jealous of leaves that can howl in the wind because of their grace only being temporary, taking shape, dust bearing no name in the winds. Shuffling at the silence at the seat of the Lord, the lovers are busy, too busy all of a sudden to hold and wet like a reed before blown into a saxophone. The note is off key. This text message bears a double meaning. The travelers are meeting and fucking. Dates are hard to get in a crisis.
The traveler fares well. They want to feel good and have the moonlight guide them to their partner's pelvis. 1, you never had me. 2, yes, there are consequences. 3, the worst has already happened. Leftists address deities by their first name, craving intimacy that organization hollowed out. Obscurity doesn't put out like he used to. He still receives my drunken emails about how sexual attention is bullshit and how Spinoza said so. He can translate tequila.
I read that because I got a text message out of nowhere saying that someone thought that my poem like this sounded like Rihanna's work like song, because she says like, no one touched me in the righteous, like no one texts me in a crisis. And, you know, texting and crises go hand in hand.
But really, you're Donald Sutherland.
I'm not Donald Sutherland. I'm Jasmine Gibson.
Lessons on starvation. Your mother will compliment your figure as psychosis pokes to the hips. A historical material analysis of generational starvation, a comedy. Walk over to the lamppost and call out his name. Paris streets stink of barbecue and empty roofs. Brown bodies learn to float in all bodies of water on the coast of new and old worlds. It's called modernity. And everything post. Do people really believe they have better things to do than struggle? Lovers can whisper about imperialism if you want them to. You can scream in the light if you need to. We lie about our youth just to fill out the flashbacks and trauma. God is blessing all of those feeling the negritude the most, doing the most, inshallah. To die totally alone in our rooms as the rub of the subway doors hits along the seam of your jacket, threatening to open up, let it. Sniff into the glass and smell the poison. Drink deep. Condos and psych hospitals side by side so that you may find your way. Baby boy's mind shattered in the brothels of Puebla. Border India casinos for white anxieties. Unanswered messages. Would you want my youth wrapped around your cock? Love is fickle and forces one into the balminess of memory. Just to remember, it is a false memory you are looking for. I got so busy looking at the past when I forgot to look up at the changing of the leaves. The people want their anthems, and their black women like their horses, being beat, feeling no pain. Devil makes 3. Can you let black and brown people be righteous when they're alive, or will you continue to place artificial flowers at electronic wakes? It doesn't matter what it is or whether it could let us be, but rather it was communism as a place we could get to and love we can never realize, and asking the question, can I fit inside you? And everyone has told me to be with you only if I could give you everything that I told you I could not give you. You continue to complain of cold houses. These are all lies, like the color of his eyes, like the lines of a Whitney Houston interview with Diane Sawyer. White women have told me I couldn't have pleasure, and I plunged deeper and deeper into train lines where crust punks and hobos go to die. It keeps me up at night, thinking of all the times I should have slapped you, and I didn't. When will you accept blackness as the exterminating angel, and that there is joy in burning shit with abandon? Heavy metal. Who knew that organs could weigh so much and absorb a city's abuses like Katrina or Flint? Repeated events like this can feel like fate, where the question of, are you sure what you put in your body isn't killing you, or this is a personal issue? But whatever, new heavy metal is in season, whether it's liquid or alkaline-like. It still cakes onto your liver and lungs like that lover you want back, but remember all of the disasters that came along with the relationship. All my goddesses are heavy metal because they were all burnt in hot irons at sea, and small villages, backyards with burning crosses and borders so segmented that they split the body in two, but it can still live and breathe and take in toxins and heavy metals. And don't that make you feel fucking expansive? Like, my God, your body on mine and how I want you to melt on my tongue kind of heavy metal. This is your welcome party. This is your potluck. It is an orientation that you woke up late for and ran 2 hours late to, just to realize you missed nothing at all. And the body sags at the wasted time of linens and ashen skin that you have to go through 3.5 hours to touch and 27 doors and 16,000 steps to be reunited once again. And it still doesn't feel as good as the lies you told yourself about how good it would feel again. These are calculations for even how you have to strain to shit. Even the little that comes out matters. What about the Syrians in pain legitimate when you realize the government and class collaborators and landowners, heads of breeding, have always had a grip on your uterus and you can feel it when it lurches, and not when daddy was a metaphor but an actual apparatus of reproduction, of stock. Me and you are the real diamonds people and other generations are forced to die for. Excavation as self-critique so that you may feel the depth of your flesh and the light wounds that can also be mortal too. Does your guilt keep others awake, or is it just you trusting yourself to be honest with yourself based on the fact that you are not that different from what you are fighting? When war makes a sound like that, how it keeps you up at night and how theory dies when it leaves your lips. Yes, Andy, I'm coming, and this is a dizzying daze on how we can't have those nice things because who really needs it, right, baby? All of my expansiveness is heavy metal, and it's not my business what you think about me. There can be a conversation in cold, but it cannot hide from what is happening, that there is a heavy metal upon the soul we cannot rid of. Am I being detained, and what warrants you here? We only mourn blacks who died for peace treaties and reasons that ultimately don't lead us to liberation. And don't let me tell you about the maroon blood that scares away the Indio skin that so many white lovers have benefited from. Yes, it's true. I can feel it when you put your fingers inside me. And right there, yes, I'm coming and present. I woke up in the middle of it all. There's a whole history of people lying about where they were born and forgetting where they got married because the seams unraveled too quickly due to the impacts missing in state records, county records, but apparent in body records, breeding like I came upon the shore in heavy metal. Thank you.
Oh. I thought you were taking that out to moderate. But yeah.
I was waiting. I thought you were texting me instructions.
So now's the time we have for questions, comments, discussions, rants, gossip. I don't know, whatever you have. If you want to ask us something or say something or talk amongst yourselves. Malign us. Go for it. Or we could read more poetry, I don't know. We've never gotten that question. That's a good one. You guys want to answer?
I mean, I think we all probably all have somewhat different things to say about it, but I mean, one of the things I would just recall is actually, so there's someone sitting 2 seats to your right named Jeff, who hosted a conference at Princeton about trust that I was at, and I talked a little bit about, in a way that's related to this question, and it's specifically actually about Juliana. Well, I feel the same about Jasper, about when you've had certain experiences, maybe in the streets or other places, which produce, I don't want to sort of go through a theory of what trust is, but it produce a sense that you think whatever that person would do, even if it's not what you would do in a given situation, is more likely to be the right thing than what you would do. That was sort of one of the ways I define trust. So when I collaborate, and I've collaborated with in writing and various other ways with both the other editors, I'm actually very happy to have them write whatever they want and I'll sign my name to it, because I trust that what they'll say is probably more worthy of what I think than what I'll say, right? And that degree of trust has come from experiences organizing and being in the streets, as we say, which is sort of a metaphor and sort of not, right? But it's very profound, just to the extent where which, so it's that we can disagree, but the sense that, like, if Jasper decides something that I disagree with, and this happens all the time, I'll be honest with you, I'm utterly willing to accept he's probably right? I just trust his sense of the world as much as I trust my own, and the same with Juliana. So it makes it very easy to do things. You don't have to agree. You can just be like, all right, we worked it through. Someone will sort of take the lead on this, and what they're going to do probably won't be that fucked up.
Juliana.
Yeah, I was trying to think about that. I'm not sure I can echo that extreme position. And then, I think, I'm trying to think something around like collaboration in some sense, like the kind of endlessness around that, and the endless ways that it's annoying at the same time. That's felt really kind of like often life changing for me. Like I do a lot of collaboration, and it's been really kind of crucial. And then to have moments where it gets kind of defined by other sorts of moments, so it's not just literary. Also, has felt really kind of productive. But I would say that this kind of editorial collaboration has been very different than a lot of other ones, which have been way more antagonistic or way more built around and sort of like internal antagonism, in which it is. I mean, there is an element of that where it's just like, well, if someone has something around it, like just like, I'll just deal with it. Like it's not, which doesn't mean feel as vex, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily coming out of like a political moment or coming out of just like being older, and just kind of like a little bit like accepting the kind of stakes around something. But I'm not sure that's the best answer. I think it's like a question that feels really hard. But
I guess I would say that like a lot of political work and political organizing, it's a total mess. There's a lot of duplicated labor and a lot of emails, but I think that really works for us, because what we don't have is we don't have a really clear division of labor where, I do the typesetting and, Juliana deals with the distributors and Joshua deals with the authors. We all do all of the things, which means that we all have to learn all of the things, which means that, there's a lot of stuff bouncing around between us, but it also means that we really do share in these processes, and there's a lot of communication. And yeah, I mean, to echo some of the things I heard, like just as I think people learn when they go to a kind of meeting where, where you're trying to kind of decide upon, things involving political work, you have to really, you have to trust people to a certain extent, and you have to kind of, let things go and not not fight to get your way on every single thing. And that's really, important thing to learn, something I've learned in, being in a lot of spaces and where, it took me some time to kind of learn how to act around other people and just kind of accept that, I don't have all the answers and I don't always know what's right. And sometimes I just kind of have to, go along with things as they are. And so, mostly it really works. And it's early on there, we did some writing for a online magazine called Jacket 2. And we didn't want to sign the pieces that we wrote as individuals. And we would have preferred to sign them as Commune editions, but the editors wouldn't allow us to do that because they had to have names attached. So they just had all three of our names. But a lot of the pieces that we wrote were written in the first person, And I had a hard time with that at first, that I was signing my name to something that someone else had written, It's like, but how can we be using I when we're really a we, And eventually I just kind of let it go, and that's what we are. We're kind of somewhere between an I and a we and a bunch of other pronouns, and so that's one of the things I've learned.
I mean, the big difference, right, is at sort of organizing meetings where you're planning an action. There's that moment where you have to run out into the yard to talk to your best friend and be like, do you think Jared's a snitch? And that never happens with the three of us. So as far as I know, unless you guys have been out in the yard. But I mean, so there are, because there is a real, as much as we want to talk about the parallels that you asked for, or the continuity, there's also real differences, right, between certain kinds of political organizing and what we do.
Yeah, I'm a writer, but I'm not a part of the editorial.
So my question might speak to that today. The relationship between trust in the shared political concerns lived and the poetry itself, the writing, and somewhere between the I and we and the I of the writing of the poetry, which does in all four cases still feel personal, though directed to something larger that's shared, so that there's the pragmatic production which amplifies or speaks to or concretizes the politics in some way, and then these shared larger values. But then there's also four very different modes of writing, and I wonder if that comes, where and when and how that comes into the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Good answer.
I'm really interested as a writer in the relationship between the individual and the collective. I mean, my book starts with the word we. And for a lot of people, we is just a really problematic pronoun, but it was the only one that made sense for this particular book, which is when you're part of, these kinds of struggles, you're part of a we, a really complex, antagonistic, contradictory we. And, I wanted to write something that was about being a part of that we. And there's not, I is a sort of placeholder pronoun in that book. And there's a lot of moments where I'm sort of trying to think through, the ways that, different forms of identity cut through these kinds of collectives and segment them and then recompose. So, and I'm still, the thing I'm working on right now, I realized that I was sort of sick of we, and I didn't want to write we anymore. So now the thing I'm writing is they, and I'm trying to kind of write, and it's sort of an exercise in point of view in some ways, and I'm trying to kind of write from the point of view of they, and sort of use free and direct discourse to kind of think of the kind of mind of a they, which is another form of collectivity, but maybe a kind of distant one that you're observing from an outside perspective. And as you know, I started writing it, and then I realized the person who'd done it better than anyone else is Juliana and her novel. And maybe I'd kind of repress that. I realized that I'm already kind of doing these things with pronouns that she's already done. So I've actually learned a lot about the way that she, thinks about pronouns and about identity and selfhood. And I think part of my experience of being anxious about signing my name to an I was I felt the experience of kind of entering into a Juliana poem. I'm sure she totally rejects this, but I feel like I've learned, that was a moment where I sort of, I felt that I was entering into this kind of lack of anxiety around pronouns that she exhibits in her work as I read it, or kind of experimentation with it, or kind of play with the possibilities of kind of being both collective and individual in her work. So I'm sure she'll reject all of that right now.
Well, was your question someone about shared politics?
I was asking about the kinds of conversation. I was just thinking about the way you were just talking about trust, and then thinking about the trust built from working together, finding ways to work together, but also.
What a true friend.
I have really good friends.
Yeah, go on. Yeah, I think.
That comes out of the literary, the conversations that respond to each other's writing. To the shared values and how those conversations, if they happen, how they happen, and because the shared commitment seems to come, at least the way you talk about it, from something in the world and political, and also the concrete work of doing the publication. But there's also the writing of the writing, and these are four really different voices, even though there's a long overlap. So I'm just wondering about those conversations and whether the trust is also contingent in any way on what you think about each other's writing. Or if that matters.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I don't really know. I mean, at a certain point, it starts the editing feels so intimate that it often feels like I wouldn't be able to even point to the boundary in some way. That feels complicated. I mean, the thing that I thought that you were asking, which I kept thinking about, we've had a lot of discussions about, we published a translation by this woman, Leslie Kaplan, who is a Maoist. But the book that we ended up publishing is kind of about a factory occupation, and it didn't feel very Maoist, but we had a lot of do we want to publish Maoist stuff, which the answer is no, but does it matter that she's a Maoist? Or that was some of the kind of discussions that felt like they showed up. So they're kind of where are the political lines, or...
I feel like somewhere in there, somewhere in your question is my knowledge that I need therapy, which is just, by which I mean, so I've done collaborative writing, poetry, and essays with both Jasper and Juliana, and those have been both extremely pleasurable and have resulted in work that I've been very happy with, extremely happy with, which is rare, right? And so what's actually unclear to me is why I still also have this, I don't even know what the right word here is, right? Urge or compulsion or unexamined habit or whatever it is of just writing by myself. Why would I do that when I believe so deeply in collectivity and when I love my friends so much and when I admire their writing so much and I admired, I'm happy to be able to say, right, that I knew them both as poets before I knew them as friends and didn't have to have that weird thing of you seem like a great person. Oh, your poems, right? And that moment never had to happen because I knew them both as poets first, really. And so why something about me still clings to also doing like my writing as me? Part of it is the way we make a living, right? But which is to say, in my job as a teacher scholar, I'm required to produce things under my own name, right? To keep getting paid. But it's a complicated question for me, you know, that you raise.
Anything to add?
Yeah, it's like, I think like when I was approached to write a chapbook for Commune Editions, I thought that they were lying, and I just thought they were full of shit. Like, it's just like, Jasper, it has a good ending. This has a good ending. Yeah, it's different where it's like, whereas like Joshua knew Juliana and Jasper as poets before seeing their poetry and like knowing about their politics. Wait, I'm sorry. I'm totally like in my head. So he knew them as poets before he knew anything about their politics, where I'm coming in like kind of different, where it's like we were all like in a, we all met in like kind of an area where they knew about my politics. And it just so happened that they were like, oh, wait, you write poetry. So kind of like coming off that, like kind of think of like trusting someone not to just like be blowing smoke up your ass, that they want to publish your work and that they actually think it's good, and like, yeah, stuff like that, where it's, yeah, that was like required like some trust, and the editing process was like totally new to me, and yeah, like that kind of trust like definitely happened, like having someone look at my work where I was like, I don't know anything about you really, I just know about who you are as a political person, you know? So that kind of vulnerability was like really constructive. Yeah.
Are there any more? I can see 30. Doesn't matter.
I have a question, actually. Kind of relating to what you were just saying then. You introduced the panel by talking about press and make a distinction between poetry and politics. Then you formally presented your poetry, but you didn't really formally present your politics. Which I don't feel necessarily clear about. My question is just why?
I think it's kind of just going off assumption that people know about your politics. You're like, yeah, like, I don't know, like a name like Commune Editions is kind of like, obvious. It wasn't like, yeah, I just thought it was obvious. Like, who the fuck is talking about communes, you know? Like, it's just like kind of weirdo, like ultra lefty people, you know? Which I think we are.
No, I think that's totally fair. It's probably, you know, not correct to assume that everybody knows, you know, what positions we're coming from. We're not totally comfortable using the term communist to refer to the press, in part because I consider myself a communist, and the press distinguishes itself by being, you know, kind of rigorously anti-capitalist and anti-state. But we're also, I think, you know, if we're going to do a poetry project like that, you need to be kind of open to a variety of different perspectives, right? It wouldn't make sense for me to say, I'm going to only, you know, publish poetry that exhibits a certain narrow ultra-left perspective, right? Because we wouldn't get that much work. So, you know, we want to publish things that are, you know, anti-capitalist and anti-state. And, you know, my own politics are that with a little bit more definition. You know, I consider myself a, you know, anti-state communist. You know, some people within Commune Editions may think of themselves more as anarchists or refuse such distinctions and labels. I think we all have a commitment to street protests. We're anti-electoral. I don't know. What else? else would you add?
That seems fair, yeah.
I mean, the one thing I think of myself as I self-identify as a communist, and yet I have some number of friends and colleagues and people I know who are professional communists, by which I mean they write for Verso, and when I explain my politics to them, they say like, "Oh, you're an anarchist," and so so there's the orthodox or more common tradition of communism as it survives in the West. My politics are not always entirely legible to that tradition, but I certainly. But I mean, we also didn't say like I'm a lyric poet, right? So we didn't name the genre of poetry. Like the poetry just had to do a certain amount of work and bear it. And our hope is that it bears more than just its own genre, but also politics as well.
We like anarchists. Most of us, at least. I'm anarcho-curious.
Don't care.
Well, I think if it was an abdication and he wasn't coming back and we could be without a president, that would be fucking awesome. But
If he had hijacked a plane, that would be great. As they used to do, right?
Constantly.
All the time, you know? That's why there's airport, metal detectors, is because people were just hijacking planes and going to Cuba every day in 1971. So just another plane lost.
I mean, the only thing that might be actually also useful about that is about the distinction, which is it not electoral curious, but but I was thinking like we have this. It's often among poets often when they think that by communist that means like the big C communist, like the state communist, but there's also a lot of hesitancy around state communism. Finally. And which has a very varied relationship, especially to arts and poetry. That like I kind of don't want to feel caught in. Finally,
there's other hands. JT.
JT?
Yeah.
JT, and then you next.
I had a question about fundamental differences between the three of you, like things that you're like, this is where we don't come together, right? And that might not be useful, but I feel like useful antagonisms is something that I feel like might be useful between the three of you, maybe. And how do you negotiate those three as like a collective body of publishing work, doing other work together aside from publishing? So, which is
I didn't recognize you.
That's like the hard, hard being together, working together, right? Like, how do you, if you can talk a little bit about if those exist, I'm sure of course they do, right? What are those and how do you negotiate through them? Does it matter to negotiate, like how does that impact the press or maybe not? Right?
Juliana likes salads.
I felt that moment when Jasper was like, some people identify as anarchists, and it like went unstated, and I'm the one that hasn't said I'm a communist. Although communist friendly, or communist curious maybe would be the word. But yeah, I mean, certainly, right? There's these constant moments of like, like what kind of goes, that are normal to like a kind of editorial process. I think the thing that it feels like that, like this kind of like the anti-state, anti-capitalist thing, which feels like the main reason for being at that moment, and which is also feels like it's not like every part of our lives are that, and like this feels like a moment when we're trying to think about what it means to be those things that may not last forever. Like I'm not something around that feels like, but that feels like that umbrella kind of feels like it's the other thing, and then there's these differences within it. I mean, I think we have really large political differences all the time, right? We fight about them at moments.
Yeah, that question sort of inspires like a little bit of a yearning in me that there was a clear, like we knew exactly what they were, right? And when they were sort of settled, like, oh, this person thinks this person thinks that, we know that. But in fact, they sort of arise fluidly, and we discover suddenly at a point, like that to the point where we have to have a vote, right? And it's 2-1, and like there's an actual disagreement. And like we never want to have a vote. We want to be like, we all agree. It doesn't like but
What's the last thing you voted on? Like, that's really interesting, but has there ever been a vote where it's like it's 2 against 1? Like,
all the time.
yeah.
Well,
How did-
I mean, they're often like stupid processy things. Like they're not like Plekhanov's theory of stagism, where it's like, what's your position, right? It's more like, do we need to make more chapbooks this year? But I mean, sorry, what?
There's a disagreement among you on Plekhanov?
I don't think we've actually had a serious discussion in the editorial committee, but my guess is we come to some agreement. No, yes. So, I mean, other people will correct me, but often we've had disagreements about whether we want to do a certain chapbook or not, and publish it, and figuring out. I mean, we're very anxious, right? On the one hand, so we're committed to publishing 3 full-length books a year, and we have our list for this upcoming year, and we think we have our list settled for next year, but it's a little uncertain, not because we're in disagreement, but because there's no total guarantee that every poet is going to deliver the manuscript they said they're going to deliver, right? So we're a little uncertain, and there's a lot of anxiety around that. And in a way, like the most intense difference that I'm trying to be pretty forthright here, like is not like an opinion about this poet or that poet, but our relation to that anxiety, right? Of like, do we need to set up our list 3 years in advance, or can we be free floating, and like it'll all come together, and we're really super different about that in different ways, and that causes a certain amount of tension.
Yeah. I'm kind of lazy, and so they always want to do something that's more expansive and going to involve more work, and I usually shoot it down at first. I'm like, no, I don't want to. That's going to be more work, but they're usually right. I can say that. I just, it's just pure reactive laziness. And then I think, it's some stuff about the list. We have these things that we want to do. We want to publish a translation every year, ideally. We only have 3 slots, right? We can't really afford to do more than 3 books, We want there to be a translation every year, Obviously, we don't want, to be publishing only white people or only men, and, trying to kind of balance our list and get work that we're really committed to, that's just the process that any press has to deal with. And so, it would be like a question of, whether it would be okay to do, 3 translations in 1 year, because that's what's on the table for us, and we may have different feelings about whether that's a problem or not, and then we have a discussion about it. But I think it's pretty, one of the things that's come up, I think, is when we're starting to articulate our views on the political efficacy of poetry. And this is where Juliana kind of distances herself, maybe, and it's like, some of my more kind of radical declarations on the matter about kind of abolition of, poets and poems. Maybe Juliana doesn't go all the way with me on that, or, Joshua has his own perspective on that, and that's okay, right? And I'm willing to sign off on her perspective, and she's willing to, sign off on mine to an extent. And if I wrote something that she said, I don't agree with this, and I don't agree with it so much that I don't want you to write it, and put the Commune edition's name behind it, I would trust her on that. So, but that doesn't usually happen. Usually we're in the zone where it's sort of like, I don't exactly see eye to eye with you on this one, but it doesn't. It's not so much of a disagreement that it really matters. We'll kind of allow ourselves that flexibility. Oki, we had one more back here, this gentleman, and then Oki.
One question is more just from the question before about politics and things like that. But it's obvious that street politics versus elections, what side you're on. But also I noticed in all of the readings, riot, looting, fire, not strike, is that part of the politics? Is that just the luck of the draw? And I was speaking to someone who went to Occupy Wall Street here in New York and Sunset Park in Brooklyn and stuff. And we always had a view of what was going on in Oakland. It was exciting, but it's obvious how some of these things that you've gone through have been referred to in the poems. Are there any ideas about how it relates to the form of what you write? Or is it?
This is, you didn't announce your book release.
Yeah, I guess I have
This is your
to.
chance to plug it.
I'll answer the first part of the question if everyone else will answer the second part about poetic form. Yeah, that question about riots and strikes is one we've all thought about a lot. And I mean, the only thing I would, speaking only for myself, but coming out of conversations I've had with people, it's not, I think, so much a question of whether anyone thinks, like riots good, strikes bad. But a sense of what is possible in the historical moment. So I actually just finished a non-poetry book that's called Riot, Strike, Riot, coincidentally. I'd like to invite you all to there's a party for it on April 30th in Dumbo. You're all invited. Verso Loft, come on by. But my argument basically is that the present conditions are pretty heavily stacked against strikes, right? There's a reason there have been a plummeting of substantial labor actions in the US since the 70s. And that's not an opposition, right? I deeply believe, my entire belief about struggle comes down to one sentence: people fight where they are. Right? And if you're in a labor organization and that's where a lot of your life takes place, you fight there. And the way you fight there is often with a strike or a labor action. And I'm not opposed to that at all. People fight where they are. My only argument is that more and more people are not in situations which provided a sort of logic and a force to the historical strike and what comes from it, the class mass party sequence and so on. So I just think things have changed. It's not a moral holding or anything like that.
I think that, the short term was, the form question was that the previous generation, which we might call language poets, were very much about how there's a politics of poetic form that have not felt applicable, or have not, that I don't have a commitment to, finally. And part of the project, quote unquote, has been an attempt to return to content, or to argue that content kind of matters when you kind of think about some of this stuff in a way that it kind of got under attended to. Previous, but that's such a specific story about an experimental avant-garde practice in some sense. But I don't think we're totally committed to the idea of a modern, a word spew as a kind of a destruction, of a kind of capitalist system that sometimes came out of early language poetry.
I would just add that two of the chapbooks that we've put out have to do with worker struggles in the workplace. And actually they're going to be, one of them is definitely going to be a book. It's going to come out later this year. It's called Miximum Kakani, The Sabotage Manuals, and it's basically based on, it's kind of reworking of a couple of texts about sabotage, but one of them is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's classic IWW text on sabotage, and it's all about struggle in the workplace. And then the other book was already mentioned. It's about, it's Leslie Kaplan's book about, kind of working, inserting herself into the kind of workplace to do Maoist organizing, in the late 60s. And so, yeah, we're interested in all kinds of struggle, but we do, I think many of us have the sense that, the place where it's really live right now is not the workplace for a bunch of reasons that some of us have argued in our kind of theoretical writings beyond commune editions. So as for form, I think it's really something that has to be determined on a project by project basis. I mean, I'm always thinking about form, but I don't have a single thought, about form that says, if line breaks are gonna, destroy capital, right? Everything is, it's contextual, right? You make formal choices based upon the particular project and the affordances that it allows. So, my book does a lot of thinking about form, and it's mostly about the opposition between prose and non-prose verse, as it were, and kind of the forms of temporality that allows. But that's a really specific thought. I wouldn't say, you have to do this. You have to write in this prosometrium form which alternates, prose and verse, because that's the most radical form. People who do that are assholes. So, yeah, that's all I can say about that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, if people are getting restless, maybe Oki, you want to ask a last question, and then we'll whiff on it and go out into the night.
I just have it's a related question about
just curious also about the future, like if there's things coming along that look like isn't maybe just like obviously poetry.
Well, our mission statement says we're open to other stuff, right? It says like we started with poetry, but we're open to other kinds of literary output that are you know, committedly anti-state, anti-capitalist. We have nothing like sort of, I mean, my sense is there'll be tons of like prose chunks in stuff that we're going to publish, but nothing that identifies itself as a novel or a collection of short stories.
Not yet. I'm not against it personally, but that would be maybe a discussion that we'd either, you know, all agree on, or maybe it would be a disagreement. I don't know. I'm open to a project like that.
It'd have to be a short novel. Printing costs very.
Yeah, this is going to be a potential disagreement. He thinks like 96 pages is a hard upper limit. I don't believe that. I want to do 700 pages.
Well, the very first chapbook we published was the transcripts from Louise Michel's 3 moments of testimony in her trials after the Commune. So we started with that, and we're very, very open to that. But I mean, we're all 4 of us, right, are known as being poets, and it's. I mean, A, it's more likely to come to us, but B, like I actually feel a slightly more legitimate competency in looking at some poems and having an opinion about it, and I actually feel much less of a competency around other forms. But I'm totally open to it. I love the manifesto form, although I hate nostalgia for avant-garde modernisms. You know.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.